Hello, everybody. Welcome back to This Weird House. I am, as always, Nick Boddick, and today we are here with a gentleman who I am ashamed to say I have not read too much of your work, but I hope to change that in the near future here. But what I have read, I have absolutely loved, and that's why we have you here. I'm here with Mr. Brandon Trenz. How are you today?
I'm great, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. I always say us. I don't know why. This is a one-man operation. So if I say us, we, it's just a weird habit I've gotten into to sound more legitimate than I am. So to start, I kind of give everybody the same baseline question. What was your introduction to the horror genre? Was it movies, books, TV?
Sure. Yeah, I don't know how many people had the same pathway. So mine was through playing Dungeons and Dragons as a preteen. Me and my friends would play, and there was one of sort of the manuals that came with it. I think it was called the Fiend Folio. A very early edition had some characters that were IP from various literary genres. So Michael Moorcock's Elric was in there, and others. And one was the Lovecraft mythos. There were certain characters in there. And I sort of read about those. So here's Cthulhu, and here's his stats, and here's Nyarlathotep, and his stats, and things like that. I said, well, that seems interesting. And then the pictures were really evocative. So I went out and I found some H.P. Lovecraft. So I started at Lovecraft at like age 12, which is really probably too young to fully get it. But it was really interesting. And I actually went from Lovecraft to Stephen King, which I think is sort of the reverse of how a lot of people experience those two authors. But absolutely. I learned, this guy Stephen King, whose name was around, was really into H.P. Lovecraft and had written a few stories that were, attempts at being Lovecraftian. And so I got into Stephen King and got into a few of the novels, but a lot of his short stories, and kind of followed it that way. And then from there, the sort of the next author I fell in love with was Clive Barker and the Books of Blood. And that was the first time I experienced reading someone's writing. So I'd read Lovecraft and some of the others, Robert Bloch and some others like that. I'd read King and some others. But when I read Clive Barker, I thought to myself, this is how I would write if I had this writer's talent. I didn't have his imagination and I didn't quite have his chops, but I could imagine that if that idea had come to me, and I had his skill, that's what I would have written. I wouldn't have written Carrie. I wouldn't have written Pet Sematary. I wouldn't have written At the Mountains of Madness. But I might have written Midnight Meat Train. I could see a through line there. And that really sort of said to me, maybe this is something I could try. And so I started really, imitating those writers, just like everybody else does. Especially once I got into college. I went into a very intensive kind of writing program at Michigan State. I made it an intensive writing program, by which I mean I went to my instructors, and let's say it was a 4-credit creative writing class, and I said, if I do twice as much work as everybody else, can I get 8 credits for this class? And they were very open to that, and they said yes. So like my last 2 years at Michigan State, there was a lot of writing, and most of it wasn't very good, but like I was really sort of building up those muscles and learning what I was good at, learning what I wasn't good at. And I kind of kept revisiting sort of the themes of horror around that time, and wrote a lot of pretty mediocre stuff, but that spark was there and never quite went away.
Yeah. So a couple of things I want to touch on there. The ordering of your kind of the discovery of the authors is, I haven't heard someone who started at Lovecraft and then worked their way kind of backward to the people. It's like you said, it's usually King is like the usual number one, obviously.
Yeah.
And then from there it's diluted outward. But yeah, it's and you did name the big 3 though. It's usually King first, Lovecraft second, and then that can kind of jumble around with Clive Barker in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And those 3, I mean, it makes sense. Between the 3 of them, they cover basically every facet of the genre, I've found. Between the 3 of them, you can get a little bit of everything from them.
For sure. From scary to weird to gory to fantastical. You get a little bit of it across all of it. And I wasn't thinking of it in these terms when I first read Books of Blood, but I really kind of liked, his very punk approach to it. It felt like, and I think some of King's early stuff was like this too, especially in short stories.
Yeah.
He got an idea and then just sort of like let the juices flow and see where he took, which doesn't mean that they weren't meticulously written. It doesn't mean that they weren't well thought out and well organized, but you could feel that they were really driven by sort of like this urgency. And that was something that was really appealing to me. So yeah, I ate up all of the books of blood and then went into all of his novels and things.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, there's like I know exactly what you mean by when you say urgency. So I have read the books of blood, but it was a very long time ago, and I've been meaning to go back to them. But I get that same feeling from, like you said, Stephen King's, some of his earlier short stories, those early collections of his, like Skeleton Crew, Night Shift. They have that. It's almost like this might not be the right word, but like a freestyle almost. Like the words are just pouring out, and this is what you end up with. And I feel like when you are that inherently talented, they end up being just great.
Oh, completely agree. And I think I always think of it in terms of they're authors where that part of their brain is just really, really active. So they can wake up in the morning. I think King has talked about this exact sort of experience. He'll just get some sort of a random thought, or he'll notice something out of the corner of his eye, and sort of this whole kind of story tapestry will start to become real in his head. He'll start to get the pictures of it and flows. And it's just because that part of his brain was kind of so active about any little, any little inspiration could turn into something. And even if the story was a little light in terms of plot, or it was a little Twilight Zone-y, a little bit of a twist at the end or something, just his imagination and his skill set were so active for that kind of storytelling that he could take just about anything. And I felt like Clive Barker was the same way. He might have been coming from a little more of a dangerous side of it. His inspiration was maybe a little bit more like that. But you could see he could take something and just turn it into this whole fully realized and very, very vivid kind of storytelling, because that's what his brain was just really good at that time.
Yeah, for sure. That's I remember I can't remember the title of the story. The first Clive Barker story I read was not The Hellbound Heart, which I feel is most people's jumping off point for him. Excuse me. It was a story where it's a guy traveling down into the subways, and I don't think it was Midnight Meat Train. He goes, and there's like this whole like community of things down there. I'm off on a tangent. I don't really have a resolution to this. I'm remembering now this story. I really need to read Books of Blood again.
Yeah. Oh, it's good stuff. And then the longer pieces like Nightbreed and things like that are just before and I love a lot of his novels.
Yes.
Well, yeah, in his novels, he was thinking much more about sort of world building and that kind of thing, which is great. And I think he did it really well in a number of his works. But I just really like, and I'm sure we'll touch on this more, I really love the economy of a short story. It needs to be punchy, it needs to be effective, and it's one of the things that kind of led me towards screenwriting eventually, because it has a lot of sort of the same challenges. So when there's somebody who's really good at that, I find myself really attracted to it.
Yeah, definitely. And then to go back to something you said earlier, I jump around a lot on this. So Dungeons and Dragons, I am actually just now, within the last month, trying my damnedest to get into tabletop gaming. I'm loving it. It's so I'm kind of splitting my attention between Dungeons and Dragons and Call of Cthulhu, and it's the breadth of storytelling in these games is astonishing. And I looked up like where a good starting place is for each of those games, and I mean literally hundreds of different answers for each thing. It's like, I think Dungeons and Dragons alone has like 400 plus full-length novels connected to it and scenarios, and it's insane. And I'm so jealous of people that already know how to do it, because it's so much to learn.
And I haven't played since junior high school, but I've sort of watched from the sidelines how it kind of it died down, and then there was this resurgence, and there's such an active community out there, and it's made up of younger people. It's made up of people who are my age who are bringing their kids into it. It's really kind of exciting. One of my very best friends from childhood. So this is one of the people who I played Dungeons and Dragons with when we were 12, 13. Now owns a game store and hosts Dungeons and Dragons. So like the things that we were obsessed with
Oh,
as
that's
children,
so cool.
that's now his career. And so I
That's
touch base with him a
amazing.
lot and say, well, why is this successful? He's like, hey, it is. It just works. It just works.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that caught magic in a bottle, or lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
So the what's the word I'm looking for? The precipice of me. I don't think that's the right word, but I'm going with it. The precipice of me reaching out to talk to you was I recently read this
Oh,
Michigan
there you
Basement
go.
by you and a guy we've talked about a lot on this show named Thomas Ligotti. And you have, as far as I know, you've written Michigan Basement in collaboration with Ligotti, as well as Crampton, I think.
Yes.
If I'm missing any, I apologize.
There's a bunch in between. Those are the two that have been published in various forms.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. And I just was kind of wondering, how did you come to be associated with Ligotti?
Sure. So Tom and I met at the publishing company where we both worked. So this was in the early 90s. I was pretty much fresh out of college with an English degree, which is not the most marketable degree in the world. But I had heard that there was this place in downtown Detroit that hired English majors because they printed books, encyclopedias and reference books. So applied and got a job there in the editorial staff. And this was copywriting, proofreading. It was typesetting. We had X-Acto blades, and we were actually moving pieces of text around and gluing it back down and sending it to our printer. It was about the very end of that, but we were doing that, which was actually pretty cool at the time. And I was aware of this writer named Thomas Ligotti because I was into Lovecraft, and so the idea of someone who was sort of considered Lovecraft adjacent, if not sort of an inheritor of his legacy, and in the Metro Detroit area. So I'm like, oh, I know about this guy. I hadn't read anything at that point, but I knew of him. And then I started at Gale Research and found out that this Ligotti guy worked there. He worked on a different floor, and I didn't know what he looked like, and I wasn't going to go seek him out. I probably passed him in the hall, 10 times a day, but didn't know what he looked like, so I wouldn't know. But that made me say, oh, I should actually read this guy's stuff. So I picked up Songs of a Dead Dreamer, and started reading that material and liked it a lot, but still hadn't sort of worked up the courage to go and find him. Well, there was a reorganization, and we found ourselves on the same team. We were working on a set of books called Contemporary Authors, which were sort of these biographical, bibliographical sketches of writers. And so we spent a lot of time doing research, and we spent a lot of time reaching out to writers and getting quotes from them, that sort of thing. So we ended up on the same team. And the first thing that happened as part of the reorganization was they took all of these new teams. They had kind of scattered everyone from their old teams and reassembled brand new teams. So most of these people hadn't worked together in any capacity before, and they had to figure out a way for us to get to know each other and start working. So they rented out one of the hotels in downtown Detroit, and they stuck all of these new teams in little conference rooms for 3-4 days, all day long, 3-4 days, and said, figure out how to work together, figure out what your work's going to be, how you're going to distribute it, how you're going to do this ownership. So me and a couple of my friends there were all locked in this room, and there was Tom. Tom was in the room. And what I discovered at that point was that we had a lot in common. But it really started, some of it was about writing, but Tom was pretty, everyone knew who Tom was, but, they were pretty respectful. They weren't going to go and just like hit him up all the time about his writing. So we ended up talking about things like the movies we liked and TV shows and the fact that we both played guitar. That was a lot of our conversation. It still makes up a lot of our conversations, was sort of that music stuff. Also found out there that he's just a really hilarious guy. We had so much fun trying to survive these 4 days in captivity, becoming a team. So when we came out, I can't guarantee that we were an especially effective team from a working standpoint, but we came out very close friends. And so then we would talk all the time just about whatever. And I think our cubes were about two cubes away from each other, so it was really easy if we were bored to just roll our seat out, roll back, and be like, "Hey, what's going on? What are you working on? Did you see Law and Order last night?" Whatever it might be. So we became friends that way, and it was really interesting because then after a certain amount of time, I did start talking to him about his writing, and it was kind of one of the first, certainly the first, I think only time I've been able to say, "Hey, I read one of your stories last night. I didn't quite get it. Tell me what's going on here. What does the ending mean? What were you trying to do?" Or I'd say, "I think I got this from it. Was I right? Was I wrong?" And sometimes he'd say, "Oh yeah, that's what I was going for." Or a lot of times he'd say, "That was kind of what I'm going for, but I'm also going for 19 other things that went over your head that happened." Or he'd say, "No, you just completely got that wrong. You read it wrong. Go back and read it again." But always in a very open, very generous guy. He's sort of an interesting combination of being very humble about his writing, but also understanding his place in literature and really wanting that place in literature. I mean, he's a guy who wants to be seen as good at what he does, and so he can be sometimes humble and sometimes self-deprecating. But if you get a little too close, once in a while, he'll sort of check you and make sure you know that no, I know what I'm doing here. Well, yeah,
you're talking to one of the greats here.
Yeah, so started a friendship that definitely continues to this day.
That's awesome. So you say he's a funny guy, and in my head I'm like, oh yeah, that really shows through in his writing. But like honestly, it kind of does. There's a lot of, I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of really truly like black humor
Completely
in Ligotti's stuff, and so I ask everybody. So I've talked to guys like John Paget and Matt Carden, who are also close to Ligotti in some capacity. Please stop, guys. Jesus. And I asked them the same question, and I would like your take on it. Are you familiar with Ligotti's story, The Small People?
I have not read The Small People.
Okay. All right. I will. I won't bug you with it, obviously, but that is the first story I ever read of his,
Mm-hmm.
and that story, it like elicited an actual physical reaction from me in a way that no other story ever has, and only like, oh my god, sorry, my cats are just going crazy right now.
That is all right.
And his work to a lesser extent has done so, but that one in particular just blew me away in a way. I can remember where I was and what I was doing when I read it. I was at work.
Yeah.
But so you meet Ligotti, you know everything you just said. When did you guys decide to collaborate?
Yeah, it was sort of interesting, and both he and I have talked about this a little bit before. So he wasn't, and I think still is not very big into collaboration. He had done a couple of things. He collaborated on a couple of volumes of short fiction, or like uber short, just like little one-pager fictions and poems, with a few other writers, including another writer, Thomas Willock, who also worked at Gale, whose work is fantastic. But he hadn't really done a whole lot about that. So it wasn't something that I ever thought, hey, I'm going to see if Tom wants to collaborate. And honestly, I was well aware that Tom and I are in vastly different levels of talent and imagination. So it wouldn't have occurred to me to say, hey, Tom, let's write something together. We were just not doing the same thing. But we were both very into the X-Files. And so this is when it was on, I think, Sunday nights. So every Monday morning, me and Tom and a couple of others would kind of waste the first hour or so of the day deconstructing last night's episode of the X-Files. And, the ones that were good, the ones that were not so good. And there were some that were very good, or at least were very good to us at the time. Especially the ones that I think were written by Darren Morgan. He did, I can't remember the titles, but the one with Charles Nelson Riley was a great one. Those sorts of things. So they were sort of operating. They were operating in a way. There were some episodes that we liked, and we're like, oh, it'd be great if they kind of went a little bit farther with it. But we knew that it wasn't something that mainstream television would ever go for. But it was fun to kind of speculate. Well, one day, I had an idea, and I don't know where this idea came from, but I had an idea, and I can't remember if I just told Tom about it or I might have even written it. If I wrote it, it was maybe 3-4 pages tops. But it was this idea of an X-Files cold open where a man, sort of a faceless man in a tuxedo, walks into the FBI headquarters, sort of breezes past security. No one notices him, or they deliberately look away when he goes by, even though they don't know they're doing it. He walks in, he steps up to an FBI agent who's sitting at his desk, shoots the FBI agent. Everyone then wakes up, sees that he's there. They tackle him. When they tackle him, he falls apart into a bunch of mannequin parts, including sort of a spinning head. And I relayed that to Tom. I said, I don't know where this would go. I don't know if it's a thing. I don't even know if it was a thing, what I would do with it. But it's something, it's an idea that I had. And I'm like, oh, mannequins, that's sort of Tom's world. So I'm like, sure, this mannequin idea I had. So I kind of shared it with him, and that was that. And then later that day, Tom found me and he said, I have some ideas about what we might want to do with that. I'm like, really? And it's funny, in one of the interviews talking about, and of course this became Crampton, one of the interviews Tom did, he said that he was really sort of obsessed with this idea for the course of that morning, and then said that he came to me and sort of like begged me to help write this into something else. That's not how I remember it. That might have been sort of what he was feeling. And probably for Tom to get to the point where he asked somebody else, hey, let's write something together, it might have had to have gotten to that point sort of inside him, that it just had to happen. What I remember is Tom said, I've got some ideas. You want to go to lunch and we'll kind of talk about it? Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. And lunch ended up lasting about 4 hours. And we came up with all of these little crazy bullet points. Most of them eventually ended up being in Crampton. So we really kind of fleshed out the idea at that point. But it was an interesting evolution because we wanted to do as little work as possible. We wanted to put as little effort as possible into this. Because we talked.
It's my life goal.
Yeah, we talked at first about, well, should we just write a spec screenplay? Now, neither of us, I had done some screenwriting at that point, but not very much. Tom had never done any. We said, well, we could probably look up what it looks like and we can write this thing, but we're both like, that sounds like a lot of work. And honestly, we're like, one of us is Thomas Ligotti. So we might not need to work as hard as somebody else to get somebody's attention on this thing.
Right.
Well, let's write, I think we wrote a 1-page or a 2-page, very high-level synopsis. And then we submitted it to some other writers, most notably Ellen Datlow, who was, editing a number of works like that and was friend of Ligotti's, and kind of ran past her and said, if we wanted to do something with this, do you even know who we would talk to or where we would go? And she came back with some ideas, a couple of connections. But then each step, we said, well, we should probably maybe take it to the next step. So we took sort of our 1-2-page synopsis and made it into, I think it was a 9-page treatment. And then we blew that up a little bit more. And then finally, we're 3/4 of the way to a script. So let's just write a spec script for this X-Files episode. And we were convinced if we wrote this and sent it in that they would make it. Why wouldn't they make it? We thought it was great. And we thought that we had sort of the secret password to go in. Like, hey, this is Thomas Ligotti. He had just Nightmare Network had just come out, so he was getting a lot of press for that. He had gotten the awards. We said this should be easy to get this in front of somebody and then start a conversation. Well, that was stupid because that's just not how things work. But we thought it was, so we tried it, and we tried it for a little while. It never really went anywhere. So then I submitted it to a writing contest. There are a number of screenplay contests out there, and there was one that featured spec scripts of our dramas. So I said, okay, we'll submit that, and even if all we do is someone comes back and reads it and says, hey, this was okay, we'll take it. That's more than we've got going on so far, so let's go with that. So we did that, and I think it came in second in the contest, and then it got a little bit more attention. But at that point, that was about all that happened with Crampton. And we were happy with it. We were proud of it. We're still proud of it. I think it's kind of fun. It sort of built up this weird little reputation on the internet as like one of the best unproduced X-Files screenplays that's out there. I don't know if I agree with that, but it felt good. It felt good to see that there were some people that it was connecting with. I still don't know if it ever had been made, and trust me, it never got anywhere close to getting made. But if in some other universe where this thing got made, I bet a lot of people would not have liked it because it doesn't. It reads enough like a real X-Files episode that I think you can imagine Mulder and Scully and all these things going through these motions, but it's so different from everything else that I
Mm-hmm.
think most of the people who go to watch it for like the weird scary monster of the week would have been like, what was that? I didn't like that. So it's maybe best
Yeah.
that it went the path that it went.
Yeah, so I read it. I read Crampton. I can't. My copy of it is somewhere over there. I meant to have them both. That and Michigan Basement here, but so I read it, and within the first, in those first 5 pages, I realized how clearly I was visualizing everything, and I'm like, holy shit! Like I haven't watched X Files in a while, but I'm watching an episode of X Files in my head. Like it was just so when I was younger, like way younger, 12 years old, I would read screenplays from some website, screenplay repository
Yeah.
website. And I still remember the first screenplay I ever read was for the Kevin Smith film Clerks.
Oh yeah, I read
And
that.
that is the reason I became a writer. I got to meet him a couple of years ago and thank him personally
Oh, that's
for
very cool.
like literally giving me the career I had. Like it's yeah. Anyways, um, and reading Crampton made me. It reminded me of what I loved so much about reading screenplays when I was younger, and I've been seeking them out again. And like it is the way that you and Ligotti and Chiroptera Press have been with Crampton and Michigan Basement is so cool because I don't know. I feel like I've never seen a published screenplay like that.
Right.
And maybe they exist all over the place and I'm just not familiar with them. But, in the circles I run in with regards to what I read, I've never seen that. And it is such a cool, unique, almost visual way of storytelling. And it's just fascinating.
Yeah, I really so first of all, I could not be more proud and humbled by the job that Jonathan Dennison and Chiroptera Press did with Crampton, Michigan Basement. They're beautiful. Um,
Yes.
and yeah, so I could not be happier with that. And I agree. I don't know of a lot. There's probably more out there that I don't know about, but I don't know of a lot of screenplays that have gotten that treatment. I think probably because most of the screenplays that I've seen that have been sort of published and that you could find at a bookstore and take off the shelf. I think the first one that I got was Pulp Fiction. I bought, and they actually you could buy the script.
I have that somewhere here. It's my all-time favorite movie.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic screenplay just to kind of see because I watched the movie first and then read the screenplay, and so sort of retroactively imagining how this screenplay was envisioned and then translated onto the screen. It made a lot of sense, but Pulp Fiction is also a good read. Like you can sit down and it is fun to read. Yeah. Some scripts are kind of dry. They are really just sort of meant to be a template for someone to go and make a movie from. I mean, they all are. But the good ones, the ones that I really enjoy reading, are a good read. And that was something that we wanted to do. And there are a lot of those out there, movies that were made, and now you can read the screenplay and see how it was done. I don't know a lot of unproduced screenplays that have been published and certainly that have been given the treatment that Crampton and Michigan Basement got. So, yeah, it's really cool. And going through that process with Chiroptera gave me a chance to reread those screenplays, which I hadn't in a while. I probably hadn't read Crampton since the late 2000s when we were kind of wrapping up the Dirtro Press version, which was a very, very small run. But I probably haven't read it since then. And I don't think I'd read Michigan Basement since we tried, since we took it to Hollywood and I took a number of meetings out there with folks around it. And I was really nervous, honestly, because I don't know that it was our best work. I think that there was a good reason why nobody bought it and turned it into a movie. So I had a lot of negative feelings about it and about the process of it, which I can go into a little bit more. But so I was hesitant. Jonathan Dennison knew of Michigan Basement because we mentioned it in an interview or some of the material surrounding Crampton. Said, oh yeah, we did a couple of works, including this thing called Michigan Basement. And he contacted me and Tom and said, do you happen to have that around anymore? Because if you do, we'd be interested. And I was really nervous. I'm like, oh, this might not be very good. This might kind of stink. And I went and I reread it, and Tom reread it, and we compared notes. Said, do we want this thing going out there? Like, our name's going to be on it, and mostly Tom. Like, my reputation is non-existent, so I don't care if something goes out with my name and it's not great. That's fine. Tom, on the other hand, is Tom Ligotti, and we wouldn't want something out there that wasn't very good. And we ultimately decided it's pretty good. It has some parts in there that we're still really proud of. It has some parts where you can tell we were sort of fumbling around, but it even those parts sort of display, us at work, trying to take these, kind of strange ideas and turn it into a more mainstream format. So ultimately we said, yeah, we think that this is pretty good. And we think enough people would be interested in it that if we put it out there and they spent their money on it, they wouldn't feel bad that they had spent their money on it. So that's how that kind of came to be.
Yeah, and actually, I did want to ask about Michigan Basement. Like, where did that was that just you two deciding to, or was it a similar thing with Crampton? Like, where one of you had an idea and wanted to expand on that idea, and then thought maybe you'd take it elsewhere and get it produced, or like how did Michigan Basement come about?
Sure. So Michigan Basement started as an adaptation of The Last Feast of Harlequin, and you can see the fingerprints of Harlequin are all over it. Yes. And the way that happened was a producer reached out to Tom and said, "Hey, I want to option The Last Feast of Harlequin, and I have a director who's interested in making this." The producer was a guy named Neil Edelstein, who at that time was working a lot with David Lynch. In fact, he worked on Mulholland Drive. So sort of around that period. And of course, we really liked Lynch and sort of appreciated, here's a guy who's making movies out of really weird ideas. All right, so that's okay, keep talking. And then the director was Elias Mirhaj, who directed an independent, like very sort of atmospheric and spooky sort of horror thing called Begotten. But then he directed the movie Shadow of the Vampire with Willem Dafoe as Max Schreck and around the filming of Nosferatu. He had just done that and was looking for his next project. And Elias loved Ligotti, loved Last Feast, and he was the one who went to Neil and said, "Hey, could you option this? I'd love to make this movie." So Tom felt like, okay, this is a project that might go somewhere. Tom has been approached a lot about people wanting to adapt his stories. He honestly, from what I know, says yes more often than no, and that's not an invitation for everybody who wants to option a Ligotti thing to try and hunt down Tom Ligotti. But if it seems like they've got an idea, an approach to it, and there's a good chance that they won't make it bad, he'll generally at least give them the option and see if they can develop it. I think the vast majority of those didn't end up going anywhere, which is just the movies in general. But in general, he's open to at least optioning something and see where it goes. So he said yes to optioning The Last Feast of Harlequin, but he also said, "Hey, my co-writer Brandon Trenz and I, we just did this X-Files thing, and we're looking for the next project. Would you let us take a crack at the script?" And we sent along Crampton, the X-Files version of Crampton, and Neil said, "Yeah, go ahead, do a draft, and then get back to me in whatever it was, 2 months or something, and we'll walk through it." So we sat down to do an adaptation of Last Feast of Harlequin. And it took us, whatever it was, 2 months or so, and we ended up with a script that we titled "Come Darkness," and it bore very little resemblance to The Last Feast of Harlequin because we kind of tripped ourselves up. We said Last Feast is an odd piece to try to turn into a movie. It's not a very cinematic thing. It's very visceral. It's very personal. It's very internal, and it's also very weird. And those are all things that I love about the story, but are challenging when you think about turning it into a movie. So we said, okay, let's take the things that we think people will like from this story, pull those out, and then try and assemble a whole other thing around it. And we did that, and I don't think that the end result was very good. I think we knew that the end result wasn't very good. But we still took it back to Neil. We said, hey, here's our first draft. And he read it. And we talked about it on the phone. With the end result of that phone call was sort of like, I don't think you got there, guys. We said, all right. We want to take another crack at it. He said, fine. So we took another 2 months or something. And we wrote what was a much more literal, or at very least reverent, adaptation of Last Feast. Like, it read very much like the book. We added a couple of characters just so that our main character had someone to talk to, so it wasn't all just going on in his head and letters and things. But we stuck pretty close to the story, and we were not unhappy with that. And we took it back. We took it back to Neil, and he read it. He said he liked it, but then the project kind of fizzled out. Didn't go anywhere. Mirhaj went on to direct another movie called Suspect Zero. Neil and his producing partner went on to be producers on The Ring and the Ring series, so they were very busy with that. And Last Feast of Harlequin kind of didn't go anywhere. And it stayed that way for a little while. But as writers, we hate for effort to be wasted. So we said, well, let's try to do something with this. And so we took Last Feast of Harlequin and we changed it just enough so that it wasn't clearly an adaptation of Last Feast of Harlequin from sort of an IP perspective. We wanted to free up the actual story of Last Feast so that it could go whatever direction, but we wanted to do something with this script. So we sort of repurposed it. We changed some things around. We added a few elements. We called it Michigan Basement. And we took it out to Hollywood. A bunch of people read it. I flew out, met with a lot of people who were somewhat interested, but ultimately not interested enough to make it. And then it went into a drawer until earlier this year.
Yeah, so as you said, the fingerprints of Last Feast are all over Michigan Basement. Anyone who is familiar with the former is going to recognize that in the latter.
For sure.
At this point, it's not really a spoiler. We've been talking about it for the last 10 minutes, but the big reveal, the welcome or greetings from Mirakaw was just such like what's the word I'm looking for? So just like vindication almost. I was like, yes, I knew it. Last Feast of the Harlequin. I got so excited when I read that. Yeah, that was just so cool. Hi, Diego. My goodness. And yeah, I loved Michigan Basement. I had never heard of a Michigan Basement before. I'm guessing that's an actual thing.
It is. So a Michigan Basement is basically, it's somewhere between a crawl space and an unfinished basement. It's usually very low. I'm 6'3". I could not stand all the way up in an actual Michigan basement. A lot of times it's dirt floor and dirt walls. People use it to store things that they don't care are going to get damp and crummy. And there are a lot of them. There are a lot of them around Michigan. Probably other states as well, though they probably don't call them that. But yeah, so yeah. And I think in one of the versions we had a more overt example of a Michigan basement. There might still be one in Michigan Basement, maybe in like Elmer's Basement or something like that. I think we still had one where the shining eyes were sort of in the gloom of one of these low, cramped little basements. But yes, so that's a Michigan Basement.
All right, yeah, that was that was interesting to learn. I was like, yeah, this must be a real thing. And yeah, another aspect of it that really harkened back to Last Feast was it's where I really noticed. I was like, okay, this is already reminiscent of it, but I feel like it's going in that direction now. Is kind of the reveal of the what to call, like the dark side of the town. Yes. Almost like and like the whole sequence in the library is just, oh man, I love it. I gotta read it again. I want to read it again right now.
Well, I'm glad you liked it. And yeah, you touched on the elements. There were a few elements we wanted to make sure that we retained from Last Feast into Michigan Basement. So one was the 2 visits. So the main character goes the first time and the place is dead. And he can't believe that there was anything there, let alone someone, who's sort of calling him to this city. And then he goes back and the city is alive because now we're near the Winter Festival. We thought that was an important thing to bring over from Last Feast because it starts getting into the duplicitous nature of this town. And then the duplicitousness is amplified when you find out there's the good part of town and the bad part of town. And we really brought in kind of this new idea where the good part of town and bad part of town had led the townspeople to the idea of kind of the good part of town is this put-up job. It's this con job where they're kidnapping from and stealing from the people who visit there. Because we said, well, if you've got this town, from a short story perspective, a town can have this weird winter clown cult in there, and that's good enough because a lot of it is, again, this very emotional, visceral response that you're having to the writing, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But in the movie, people want it to make a little more sense. Even in something that doesn't make sense, it's got to kind of abide by its own rules, right? So the rules of Miraca were that it exists in sort of this spot where you have these other entities, and they are more powerful around the winter solstice, and it brings this Thoth character into the town. But the town adapts to it and really leverages the duplicitous nature for their own enrichment, and that made us laugh. We thought that was great, and we could imagine a bunch of scenes with people who are nice to people's faces and then are not nice behind their backs, and we thought, sort of that fun, mean-spiritedness we did a lot with.
Yeah, for sure. I thought the Michigan Basement handled it very well, because you are right. Like on a surface level, Last Feast it would be very difficult to do a 1-to-1 adaptation, because, like you said, so much of it is not going on in the main character's head, but like you said, there's not really a whole lot of external communication,
right?
Which is interesting, and I see that in a lot of Ligotti's stories, which I feel like that may be a reason why we don't see a ton of adaptations. Like you said, I know I'm sure a lot of people do request, but that would be, from a writing perspective, that would be my biggest hang up. I would get so caught up on, I want to adapt it, but I need to change this, but I don't want to change it too much because I love the original story. Like, no. It's a fine line to walk.
And it was something we gave ourselves permission to do early on. And again, Tom is very he's very generous about how we approached this writing. And early on, we said, when we said it was Last Feast, we said, we don't think that we can write this exactly like it's written. And I said, Tom, are you okay with that? Because people love this story. I love this story for all very legitimate reasons. We're going to leave a lot of that behind, but it's not like the story stops being the story. People who love the story will always love the story. People who encounter it fresh will encounter it fresh, and they'll fall in love with it as well. The story stands on its own and will always be its thing. This is a whole nother thing. And it's okay if we change things, if we leave things behind, if we introduce new stuff, because it has kind of a different purpose, it has a different life. And when we made that decision, then we could just sort of play with the parts that we liked. We wanted to bring in enough that Ligotti fans would recognize what they're reading. What we pictured was Ligotti fans in the theater. We're imagining a packed theater where this is happening, and there are 3 people up front who kind of do the bit like, "Hey, that's from the story." That would have been like our ideal. Is that the Ligotti fans were sort of sending them little coded signals that they're watching this story unfold. But yeah, so that was an important decision that we said, the story is the story, will always be the story, and so now we can do what we want with it.
Yeah, that's a smart way to look at it. So in terms of, screenplays, those 2, Michigan Basement, Crampton, were not produced. I saw, when I was kind of doing, my due diligence on you, I saw that you were a writer alongside Ligotti on an adaptation of The Frolic.
Yes.
So I'm just kind of curious about that. I haven't seen it. I'm just kind of curious how that all went.
Yeah. So one of my good friends is named Jane Kelly Kosek. She worked at Gale Research, where Tom and I worked as well. And then in the 90s, she moved to New York and then to Hollywood, and started working as a producer. Worked on a number of very big films. And then she started working with a director named Jacob Cooney on a low budget sort of indie psychological horror movie. And then coming out of that, they said, well, we want to make something else. We think we want to do a short. And said, and came to me and said, are there any Ligotti stories that might be a good fit for this? So I talked to Tom, and Tom always felt that The Frolic was one of his more mainstream stories. In fact, he said
100%.
he was trying to be very mainstream when he wrote that, which I always thought was interesting because it's not like a mainstream story because it's got his voice and it has his imagination and all those sorts of things. But he felt like that he got close, and I had to tell him like, I don't know if it's as close as you think it is, but that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
So we said, okay, well, let's do that. So we signed up to do the adaptation as a short. Now, short films are normally, they run 8 minutes, 10 minutes, 12 minutes, something like that. I think this runs somewhere in the 20-minute mark, and that was with us cutting a lot down. But when we approached that one very differently from Crampton and Michigan Basement. With those, it was a little bit more of an equal partnership in that, like, Tom would have a lot of, we both bring ideas to the table. A lot of times Tom's ideas, I think, were much better than mine. But my job there was to kind of say, okay, even his craziest ideas, his most imaginary ideas, which I would love to have seen, how do we turn this into something that's a script for what might be a recognizable film? So there was a lot of meeting in the middle, just because those movies, we wanted them to be movies. We wanted them to be things that somebody would put money behind and produce and release, and we'd see them in the theater. So we knew that we kind of had to rein in the Ligotti-ness of the story to something that was a little more palatable, or a little more recognizable. With the Frolic, we went the other way. We said, we're going to go, Tom, you say how this thing's going to be. I'll come in and I'll add some thoughts. I'll maybe work as kind of an editor. Maybe where we're adding characters and giving them voice, I'll maybe do that. But really, instead of it being 50-50, it was much more 80-20 or 90-10. And especially since this was going to have, this was clearly a short from a story by Tom Ligotti, we wanted the connection to be much, much stronger between the two.
Yeah.
It's still not 100%, but it's pretty close. And I think we did a nice job with it. So I was actually on set for the shooting of that. They found old mental asylum that they allowed to do shooting in. We shot at that in the middle of the night, which was very, very spooky.
That's so cool.
And I think they did a really, really nice job with it. It showed at some festivals. I know it showed at one of the horror conventions. It actually showed at the Cannes Film Festival. They've got like a short film corner where short films will kind of show. And if you're interested, you can talk to somebody there about picking up. No one picked it up, but it showed there. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah,
so we were really happy with how that turned out.
Yeah, I would love to see that. Is it available anywhere?
I don't know where it's available. I know for a little while it was on Tubi. I don't know if it's out there anymore. And there was a short DVD run of it as well.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny you say about the Frolic being mainstream, because usually because I belong to a bunch of subreddits dedicated to like weird fiction or Ligotti, his work, Lovecraft stuff, and people, it seems like every week someone's asking, oh, where to start with Ligotti, and the most common answer by far, if they're looking for a specific story, is the Frolic. And I'm like yes, I also consider it to be his most mainstream story.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not a mainstream story.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a sliding scale for sure. It may be his most mainstream story, but yeah, I mean, it starts with a character who kills children, which was kind of tough, and a character that you're supposed to feel at least a little bit of sympathy for. I mean, it's a character who, in his world, believes that he is freeing these children from the agony of living in this world and growing up and being an adult, which was kind of foreshadowing a lot of the antinatalism, I think, that Tom really embraced later on. That can be a tough sell. And we were actually asked to put together a treatment for a feature film and shop it around. And we just couldn't crack how dark that was. Like, we said, we can't think of very many they wanted a serial killer thing. We can't think of too many supernatural serial killers where he actually kills children. Teenagers, yes, all day long. But little kids, and then says they're better dead, we couldn't really find a lot of comparisons out there.
Even though people weren't biting on that?
To do it.
Yeah, that is a tough sell. I can't say I'm surprised by
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Um, so again, to jump around, back to the X-Files, just kind of an anecdote on my part is, do you happen to recall an episode? It was written by Stephen King,
Mm,
and it was about, I only vaguely remember it. I remember something of it though. It was like a doll that would come to life, but you would never see the doll actually move, but this doll was killing people.
yes.
And I remember, there's not really a point to this story. It's just that I remember that was the first nightmare that I can ever recall having, and it just terrified me.
So what was it, a
And
nightmare inspired by that episode?
yes,
No.
yes,
Yeah, yeah.
like directly related. Like if I remember right, and maybe this is, I was maybe 5 years old, so 30 years ago or
Mhm.
something, whatever it was. I saw that episode, went to sleep that night, and in my head I had that nightmare, and then once I was done screaming and my mom comforted me back to sleep,
Yeah.
I remember having another unrelated nightmare that night, and I was like, oh, "This is my life now.
Yeah.
This is every
I'm
night for
never
the
going to
rest of
sleep
my
again.
life." Yeah,
I do.
yeah,
I
and
remember that episode, and that was happening kind of around the time of Crampton, because they were bringing some of these other writers. So Stephen King wrote one. William Gibson wrote a couple of episodes. They were
oh,
sort
okay.
of having these guests come in, and so we thought the door was open for us to say, "Hey, us too," and of course it didn't happen. But yeah, it was an interesting period around there, and I do remember that episode.
Yeah, that it's just, that was a game changer for me.
Hmm.
That, because it kind of got me interested in horror a little bit, because I remember my stepdad at the time watched X Files, and I mean, I was very young. I think I said I was 5 years old. I was a little bit older than that. I think probably 8, 9, somewhere in there. But I did, I had no idea what I was watching. I just knew that I was kind of being drawn to it. And once I got over the initial terror of that nightmare, I was like, okay, I actually kind of didn't mind that episode.
Yeah,
Like that feeling was cool. And that, to kind of bring it back around to Ligotti and to Michigan Basement in particular, like that feeling of, because I read horror every day, and this is in no way, all due respect to all the writers that I read on a daily basis, but there is an almost nostalgic feeling to Ligotti's, and in turn your work, that I specifically get from these stories, and it's just, I wish I could find it in more. It's such a cool feeling, and
yeah.
like it's so cool to that you got to be a part of that and create that feeling for people.
And yeah, and it was super cool. It was most of the time a lot of fun. Some days it was less fun, but that's when we were trying to crack an idea and we weren't getting there. Although we came up with some really wacky stuff. It didn't last more than about a day or so before we're like, no, we can't build on that. But we had some days where we had some crazy things. But one of the things that I love about Ligotti's writing that also made adapting it or turning it into, kind of funneling it towards a screenplay format so challenging is because I think, and I think others have written way, way, way more about Ligotti than I could ever express. But what I feel when I read his stuff is it's very dreamlike, and or you could say nightmare like, because it, I think, like you experience, you feel a lot of the feeling he's trying to evoke. Now his use of language is fantastic. A lot of it, even the prose, can feel very poetic, and I love that kind of thing. But sort of the sense that it builds up is very unnatural. It's very sort of dreamlike, nightmarish. And the things about dreams and nightmares is you are not in control of those situations. Like,
Yeah.
things are happening. A lot of times it's very strange, unsettling things, creates a lot of anxiety, creates a lot of fear. But you're kind of there until you wake up. And that's how I felt about a lot of Ligotti's work. I feel like that's kind of what he taps into, which must be that's the part of his imagination that he's trying to convey and put onto paper. And so when you get that
Yeah.
feeling like this is very unreal, but I'm still feeling like I am in this. Like, I have the same stakes as the people who this is happening to in this story.
Yeah.
That's how it feels dreamlike to me. It's sort of like these are very strange things happening, and I'm just caught up in it until we get to the end of this ride. And I don't know of a
Yeah.
lot of other writers that I've had that feeling about.
Yeah, then that's exactly what I mean. It really is a unique reading experience reading Ligotti stuff, and I love what you guys have created. And yeah, sorry, I could go on and on about how much I love Michigan Basement, how much I love Crampton and all of it, but I
No.
just really I thank you so much for coming on today and talking with me, Brandon. It's truly a privilege.
Oh, absolutely. It was great being on. It's a great conversation, man.
Yeah. Do you have anywhere? So I actually don't know your current status, like as a writer. Do you have other stuff you're putting out? Do you have social media you want to drive people to? Books you want people to buy? Anything you want to shout out?
No, I still write a lot of screenplays. I've got a few other things that were produced. Some low budget horror stuff, a low budget comedy, and things like that. Just little projects that came along that seemed kind of interesting. Had fun writing them, and not completely embarrassed about the end result, with one exception. Um, there's always one exception, right? Um,
Always.
so yeah, I'm still working with my friends and producers and contacts in Hollywood and directors I've worked with, and we've got some projects that are cooking. Nothing that's imminent, but no, nothing else out there that's available for purchase. No real social media presence. Just me out here.
Fair enough. Then I will just tell everyone: buy Michigan Basement, buy Crampton, Chiroptera Press. They are truly beautiful books. Brandon, thank you again.
Thank
I will talk to you soon, buddy.
thank you very much, Nick.
Bye.